I suggest, so thank you, Iris. I suggest we move forward, and I'm leaving the floor to Domitille DESSERTINE, who is speaking on the behalf of the French Financial Market Authority. In French or in English, whatever you want.
Thank you very much. Since everybody's spoken in English, I think I will do the same. Hello, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. I'm very happy to speak about what we've done in the area of ICOs and crypto assets, since we've been, I would say, quite active on this front over the past few months, years, because it's been almost 15 months, I guess, that we've been working on these issues, so quite a lot. So obviously, we also participated in the discussions with our peers, regulators, and we chose to have somehow, I would say, a different approach to ICOs and crypto assets. So that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. So first thing, let me start. Perhaps I believe, I'm sorry, I did not attend to all the discussions today, so perhaps I'm going to say some things that you've already heard during the day, so apologies for this. One major point, I think, when considering ICOs is to look at the tokens that are issued. And that's something that is that has been touched upon by the different presentations today. So as Iris and Alexis mentioned, you have now quite a broad agreement that tokens can be classified according to some three, I would say, broad buckets. So the first one would be payment tokens, so meaning that the tokens is used as a mean of exchange. The second one would be utility tokens, so it gives the right to a service and access to a service that is already developed or that is going to be developed in the near future. And the third one would be securities tokens. So, well, as much as I have sympathy for these classifications, because I understand that it's much easier to put things into clear categories, I must say that it's quite complicated to classify the tokens according to such categories. We've met with a lot of projects, and most of the tokens that we've seen are actually hybrids, so they really present features that can classify them in at least two categories, and then their nature can change during their life. So the most famous example of this would be Ether, I would guess, because it was the first utility token giving access to the Ethereum blockchain, and then it became a payment asset or a cryptocurrency. So it's an interesting example of having tokens that have features changing over the course of their lives. So this is very difficult for us to have a legal qualification of tokens. So that's why we decided not to go with the securities approach of the US, meaning that all the tokens should be more or less considered as securities. We think that ICOs and the issuance of tokens actually raises a lot of very interesting questions. So the first one, of course, is what's the role of the money? What's the role of the intermediaries? And Alexis touched upon that issues. So what's the role of the regulator? We are also questioned by this phenomenon, and that's something that we try to reflect on over the past few months as well. What's the role of the stakeholder? This is also something that is questioned by this phenomenon, and we don't think that we should overlook all of these issues that raises some very important questions. We think it's essential to grasp the very reasons behind that phenomenon that shows that it's, in our view, a structural long-term trend. When you look at the advantages that offer ICOs, so Alexis mentions the willingness, the cost, the lower cost that offer this type of operation. That is true, even though it's less and less true because ICOs tend to be more structured as the time passes, and the documents that are presented to us tend to be thicker and thicker. So it's very close to a prospectus now. But that's one advantage, that for sure. Another advantage is to speed up the execution time for financial transactions, including the public offers of securities or the active fundraising. Another very important advantage that we see in ICOs is the ability for a project to tap a global market to raise funds. So this is something that is quite different from crowdfunding, to which ICOs are very often compared, because we see that crowdfunding operations remain very local. It's usually love money and a little bit more than that, but it's rarely global. While in ICOs, the aim is really to tap global investors. So this is a very important advantage for us. Another advantage that should be mentioned is that ICO provide the ability to finance the development of a service at the very early stage of the development. And this funding can be done by the users, the potential future users of the service, and not by some stakeholders, so without diluting the share capital of the society. So it's very difficult to grasp for financial people like us, because some of the ICOs projects don't really offer any rights to the investors except the right to access a potential future service, but still they raise some money. Another advantage is to create some network effects, and I think that's a very important point as well. Really, most of the projects aim to create some sort of Amazon-like environment. So we know that most of them won't succeed in doing this, but I think this is something that is very important also, because it's not only specialized in the crypto asset environment, it is also visible in the traditional world, I would say. So we've been very active on this front, but this is not something that is completely, I would say, legitimate. Well, one can wonder why securities market regulators would intervene in that environment, since it's not all the time qualified as a securities. So I would say we considered that our legitimacy to intervene in that environment was threefold. First, we saw an investor protection stake with ICOs and crypto assets environments. We noticed a surge in the scams and the fraud, so we have an investor protection desk where we received some calls from investors that have been stuck in frauds, and very recently we saw a surge in the frauds that are related to crypto assets, not so much ICOs, I should say, but the frauds related to investment in cryptocurrencies such as Bitcoin, Ether, so on and so forth. So we considered that the absence of regulations also favors this type of behaviors and the proliferation of frauds. So this was the first objective when thinking of a new regulatory framework. It was to better protect investors. The second goal is to help the funding of innovation, and this is something that is very important. We've met with a lot of different types of projects, and some of them, I'm not saying all of them, but most of them are quite serious projects, and we see these types of operation as an interesting new way for them to raise some capital. So we know that in France and in Europe, there is sometimes a lack of capital for startups, so they can find quite easily some early stage capital, seed capital, first stage capital, Series A, Series B, but then just pre-IPO capital is often very difficult for them to raise, and so that's where usually they can go abroad to seek for venture capital or private equity capital, and we think that is quite a pity for European competitiveness. So we see ICOs as an interesting new way for these startups to potentially become scale-ups and then to conduct an IPO. So we don't see ICO completely exclusive from ICOs. And the last, perhaps, goal behind our work on ICOs and crypto assets is competitiveness. As I said, we think that it's also the fact to create a regulatory framework is also something that can help attract some serious projects in Europe and in France in particular. So what have we done? Basically, as it was mentioned, we published a consultation on the 26th of October last year. So this consultation, as I mentioned, we started to work on these topics because we received a lot of requests also from entrepreneurs that were willing to launch their own ICOs and that were willing to do it right. So meaning that they were they wanted to clarify whether they should abide by public offerings of securities regulation, basically. So we started to have legal discussions internally in the EMF. With the legal department, and so we published this consultation where basically we were discussing to what extent these tokens and these operations should qualify as securities as defined by the prospectus regulation in Europe, or whether it should fall into different types of other regulatory regimes, so mainly AFMD, Alternative Investment Fund Managers Directive, or the crowdfunding regulation. We also examined whether it should fall within a national regime that is quite not well known, that is the intermediary in miscellaneous assets regime. So it's quite hard to explain abroad to my fellow colleagues, but basically it's national regulation that was set in place in the 80s and that aimed to oversee the offering of investment in atypical goods. So it can be, for instance, work of art or wine or forests or so on and so forth. So arguably, one could say that Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies are atypical goods. So we wondered, we examined as part of this consultation to what extent they would fall into this national regime. So the conclusion of this legal analysis was that in most cases, actually, the tokens issued through ICO would not fall under the existing regulations. So based on this conclusion, we were proposing three options for three way forwards for potential future regulations. So the first one was to have basically some good practices. So meaning that those tokens that would fall into existing regulation would be regulated by the existing frameworks, but for the vast majority of them, we could craft some good practices that they would be free to respect or not. So that was the first option. The second one was to expand the scope of existing regulations, and mainly, for instance, prospectus regulation to capture the tokens. And the third option was to design an ad hoc regime, so a specific regulation that could be either mandatory, meaning that all the offers would have to abide by these new rules, or optional, meaning that only those that would like to have some sort of a regulatory approval and that would meet some of the criteria, of some of the guarantees that we would define, could obtain that approval. So this consultation was actually a great success. It received 82 responses, which is quite rare for a consultation that is proposed by the EMF. Interestingly also, the responses came from a wide array of players. So we had our usual suspects, I would say, so market infrastructures, banks, law firms, audit firms, industry associations, but we also had some people that had already undertaken their ICOs or that were looking forward to undertake one. We had some associations of IT engineers, so a very broad range of players, which was for us very interesting. What came out quite clearly was that people agreed with our conclusion that it was very difficult to classify a token or to make them fit into existing legal categories. Some of the responses were proposing some classifications. We had some very extensive legal analysis of different types of token, but in the end, they all agreed that there was such a variety of different types of token that it would be very difficult to make them fit into a single categories. Another interesting takeaway was that there has not been any strong pushback against our initiative to propose some potential regulation. This is interesting. This was actually a surprise to us because we heard in many conferences that crypto asset environment was libertarian and that people didn't want regulators to step in. Actually, it was quite the contrary that came out from the consultations. People were actually asking for regulation because they saw it as a way to distinguish serious projects from scams and frauds, as I said earlier. So it was quite interesting. It's been quite a while that we haven't been asked to regulate something, I would say, at least in the traditional environment. Another interesting aspect was that the wide, very, very broad majority of the responses were in favor of a new ad hoc tailored regulatory regime that would be optional. So not a mandatory one. So this came also as a surprise because it's not really the way that we work usually to have some optional regimes. Only 2% of the responses were in favor of extending the scope of existing regulations. So this was also very important to us because today it's also a discussion that we're having at the European level to know whether we should capture those operations within the existing frameworks. So this was very interesting to us. Some of the responses raised the question that if some of the raised the point that if some of the instruments were presenting some aspects that could make them, look like securities more or less, they should not be regulated as securities because mostly the regulatory frameworks for securities are not adapted to that environment. And this is a comment that we considered. So the responses were basically in favor of a tailored regime that would clarify basically the information that should be contained in a white paper. So, we call it an information document. It's more regulatory style, but it's a white paper in that environment. So basically, the responses were proposing some information, standard information that should be included in all of the documents. So we listed that in the summary of the responses we received to the consultation and that we published last March. So in this sense, it's quite close to the prospectus regulation, since that's also a regulation where we standardize the information that an issuer should give. But in addition to that, the responses also indicated that there was a need to have some additional safeguards. So for instance, the need to have some sort of a mechanism that would secure the funds raised during the operation. So in the environment, this often takes the form of a multi-sig wallet. So I'm not sure if you are familiar with this, but I'm sure many people today spoke about that. So I'm not going to explain it myself. Another important point that was raised in the responses was the need to have some adequate anti-money laundering and terrorism financing mechanism in place. So this is also quite a significant difference from the traditional environment, since when you do a public offering of securities, these checks, I would say, are conducted by some intermediaries, so the banks. But in that environment, in the crypto environment, there would be a need for the issuers to conduct themselves these diligences. So it's quite a significant differences from the traditional framework. So alongside the publication of the consultation document, we launched also a program that is called Unicorn for a universal node for ICO research and network. So it's a very funny name. A lot of fellow regulators talked about us of this name. But basically behind this program was a call for project holders to come and see us, to explain to us their projects so that we could better understand the economic nature of the instruments that were issued through ICOs, so that we could also better understand the technology, the underlying technology of these operations. So it was actually a great success also. We met with about 55 projects of ICO so far. So out of these 50 projects, 16 ICOs are already conducted, and they raised about 160 million euros. So it's quite significant amount of money raised, and it makes it an important phenomenon that we should consider. Out of these 50 projects, more than 40 ICOs are ongoing or that are planned for the end of 2018. So it's rarely for 2019. They are quite ambitious in terms of a time frame. And so taken all together, these 55 projects ambition to raise 1.3 billion euros, which is very significant and makes it quite different from the amounts raised through crowdfunding. So I should mention that these amounts are still prospective and they are not conducted yet. And some ICOs, some operations are very ambitious. They aim to raise between 100 and 300 million euros. So we'll see if it goes well. But the majority of them aim to raise about between 5 and 30 million of euros, which is still quite significant. And for most of them, they would be beyond, the threshold that is set for prospectus. So among the projects that we've met as part of the Unicorn program, it's very interesting to note that they come from very broad diversity of sectors. So we met some projects in real estate, in hotel bookings, of course financial services such as asset management, hedging, but we also met some projects on cloud, insurance, renewable energies, regtechs, data mining, also about the job market. We also made a project that aimed to create a law court. So it was very interesting. So in the health project, art, movies, very broad range of different sectors. So in most cases, the projects aim to create some marketplaces where the tokens would be used as a way to access this marketplace, but also as a mean of exchange within the marketplace. So that's what I was saying. It's quite hybrid. You can have some sort of a payment utility / security because it's always, or at least they aim to be listed in the secondary markets. So it merges a lot of different characteristics. And from a regulatory standpoint, also what is interesting is that we've met with very few projects that wanted to be qualified as a securities. So it was a kind of a trend last year, but still we are starting to see some. So that's also an interesting point because of course the security qualification raises some regulatory issue, but it has also some tax implications that are more favorable than for utility tokens. So in conclusion, what I would say is that, as you probably saw, we are about to have, at least there were a proposal to have a new ICO regime included in the draft law pact that is to be discussed by the Parliament starting from this autumn. So we expect a decision, at least we expect to be ready to approve some of these operations starting from next year, early next year. So we will need, of course, to clarify what will be the rules and what will be the guarantees that we will expect from the projects that we will approve. So obviously we will build our regulation on the summary of the responses that we received to the consultation. But beyond ICOs, I think, and that's something that our chairman, Robert Hoffel, mentioned when he was testimonying before the Assemblée Nationale 2 months ago, beyond the ICOs, there are all a wide range of issues that should be tackled in the crypto assets environment. We see 4 priorities. First, we need to have some appropriate product information. So that's what we aim to have with this ICO label. We need to have some transparency on issuers and investors. So also this is an important point on which we will build our framework. We also need to have a price formation mechanism that is transparent and ensures market integrity. So this is more about the regulation of exchanges. So this is something that is also very much needed in our view. And finally, we need a secure market chain, both from the legal standpoint. So this, of course, means that we need to have the proof that the holding of an asset when you have it recorded on a blockchain. But also we need to have a secure chain from an operational standpoint. So it means that you have some very important cyber risks that are present in that environment that must be tackled as well. So as I mentioned, we believe that this must be deployed both on primary and secondary markets. So that's why we recommend we will have an approach that is based on these two pillars. So the first one is the ICO regime that I've talked about, and the second one will be an appropriate regulation of the exchanges that we will reflect upon. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for one or two questions.
Thank you very much for this talk. You visibly try to push ICO because they are very useful. And it was mentioned earlier that it's very hard for ICO proponents to open bank accounts in Europe. What can be done about that, and are banks too cautious, perhaps?
Well, too cautious, I'm not sure. They are scared, that's for sure. Well, scared, I mean, they would like to have some more security. That's really also, we hope, that the fact that we build some regulatory framework will help the relationship between banks and project holders. So this is an issue that has been raised many, many times by a lot of, well, quite all the projects that we've met with. But also, well, we hope that the fact that we give some approval will give some comfort to the board, to the banks. And as I said, that's why we think that the fact for issuers to have a mechanism to do some appropriate checks on the anti-money laundering risks is very important, because that's actually what the banks are scared about, is the origins of the funds.
Another question?
May I ask a question? With regard to exchanges first, how do you think France can regulate exchanges? I'm not sure that there are a lot of exchanges in France. I think there are none. So, one. Great. So, okay, but I mean, that is my first question. And then the second question, even though I get the point about the anti-money laundering and account opening, I think that is the reason, because actually when you look into the texts, anti-money laundering provisions do not apply to any kind of ICOs. But if I get the point that, of course, if you do KYC and anti-money laundering provisions, then you might go and see a bank and see and tell her, this is the origin of my funds. But my point is another. I mean, you said it yourself. If you do an IPO, you do not apply anti-money laundering provisions. So what justifies it that if you launch, for example, a security like ICO, you do have to do that?
Well, for securities like ICOs, they would be regulated with the traditional framework. So no AML. So we haven't had these cases yet, I should say, because I think this will raise a lot of other questions if you have a full security ICOs, but out of the 55 projects that we've seen, we think that is, I would say, perhaps 2 of them that could qualify, well, that would present some of the characteristics of a security, but not all. I mean, they generally don't have, you can have some voting rights, but it's not necessarily about the governance of the society, of the company. You can have some profits, but it's not necessarily dividends of the company. You can have, it's rarely the proof of the ownership of a share into the social equity of the company. So I think it's quite often far from securities. So we haven't had this case yet, but should you have a full equity tokenized, it should apply the existing regulatory framework. There is no doubt about that. But there would be other questions about then what to do with, they could potentially become eligible to funds, investment funds. You have other problems, because then if you are a security, you need to evolve in a structured environment. So meaning if you are dealt on an exchange, you need to have an ecosystem of players that is present, meaning custodian, central depository. You need to have all these players here, which is not the case in the crypto asset environment. So I believe this would raise other questions, the security path. Your first point was about the exchanges. That is true. We have very few of them. So actually we have two. Two that I would say are, well, to our knowledge, those that have come and see us. So two that I would say that could be qualified as an exchange, in the sense that like a securities exchange, the way that we understand them, meaning with a central order book. But we also have some players that could be more qualified as broker-dealers, more or less, so with significant counterparty risk for players, for investors. So this is how we differentiate them. So you have exchanges and broker-dealers in our understanding. So it's true that we have very few players. So that's why we are discussing, but nothing is firm yet. We are discussing a way to perhaps regulate while being attractive. So because we know that there is also the need in that environment to have some regulation. So we recently saw that some huge platform came back in Europe, so in a tiny island, to set up their headquarters there because a regulation was adopted. So we don't aim to attract all the existing platforms, but we would aim to have, if there should be a serious project developed, one that would abide by the regulatory rules, we would like to have it in Europe and to have a regulatory framework that is ready to welcome it. We want also to accompany our players, even though they are not so numerous. They came to see us also asking for regulation, because there are a lot of frauds and scams, as I said, and they suffer from that. So they want to distinguish themselves from the fraudulent activities that can happen on the internet. So this is also something that we are considering to offer some support also to our players, even though they are not so numerous. But we hope that in a few years' time, there will be more than a couple of players.
Thank you.